The podcast you're about to hear includes the story of a Katzie man named Slumuk. Members of the Katzie First Nation have been instrumental in us telling this story properly. We acknowledge that the story of Slumuk originates from the ancestral lands of the Katzie people. What you're about to hear, you may find graphic and violent in nature. Listener discretion is advised. Just before 8 a.m. on January 16, 1891, the hangman arrived at a jail cell to take an elderly, indigenous man towards the gallows. The man's name was Slumuk, and not long after his death, rumors began to surface that he had discovered a lucrative and hidden stash of gold in the mountains, a source worth billions. It is said that just before he was hanged, he muttered the words as a warning to anyone who dared to search for his gold mine. Nika memlus, mein memlus. Loosely translated from the Chinook language, the words mean, when I die, the mine dies. Less than a decade later, on August 26, 1899, the name Volcanic City first appeared in the Cascade Record newspaper. It was said to be a city on a hill filled with wealth and abundance in the mineral richness of southern British Columbia. By 1928, almost 30 years later, Volcanic City was a ghost town, and its founder would vanish only 3 years later. I'm Kru Williams, and this is Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold. Episode 4, Volcanic Boom. When Robert Allen Brown settled permanently in BC in the 1880s, he was not yet known as Volcanic. Because of his antics and the lengths he would go in search of mineral wealth, he was then known as Crazy Brown. In a 1917 newspaper interview, he talked a bit about his epic journey out west. Quote, "During the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, I prospected on either side of the roadbed from Banff to the coast, and coming back to Revelstoke, BC, made a dugout canoe and followed the river to Marcus, Washington." End quote. Let me pause here to say that Crazy Brown was pushing 40 when he said he rafted down the Columbia River, the mightiest in the Pacific Northwest. That's about 350 kilometers in a canoe he carved by hand from a tree trunk. If that's not crazy, I don't know what is. Brown went on to say that, quote, "While there, a traveler returning from the north gave me a piece of silver ore, which I assayed and found to run 900 ounces of silver. But as he was telling me the location of the claim, we were overheard by 2 other prospectors who immediately set out for the place. To head them off, it was necessary for me to make most of the trip on snowshoes over an unsettled region, suffering the greatest hardships on the trip. But I arrived there 3 days before my rivals. No deposit of silver, however, could be found." End quote. My good friend and Dead Man's Curse team member, Adam Palmer, has been fascinated by Brown's story for years. He thinks it shows that Brown's fortitude and drive were impossible to ignore.
He made a name for himself very quickly. He was able to push himself and get himself out there, right in the middle of the mining world. He would put up claims, sell claims, and he had many skills. He had the foresight. He was after copper, aluminum, all these other minerals that he saw could be useful in an economic world that was soon enveloping the whole Pacific Northwest at that time. This is, before the gold rush and after the gold rush. There was a big need for mineral resources, not just gold.
Volcanic Brown took advantage of the vast and varied mineral wealth of British Columbia before the legend of Slumuk's lost gold mine took hold of him. He tried to build a world and legacy filled with booms and busts. Fortunes were made and lost. That's how you made it in the prospecting world. Get rich or die trying. If you don't go crazy along the way. The specter of all those dreams, the abandoned mines, the ghost towns, the flickers of the past, they're still with us, calling, beckoning to us from beyond the veil. What do they say? if you stay still and listen closely, you might hear it. Because we found that dead men do tell tales. So far on the TV show and podcasts, we've been focused on the Pitt Lake region, located about 40 kilometers east of downtown Vancouver. But precious minerals can be found throughout British Columbia. The vast province spans nearly 945,000 square kilometers, or about 365,000 square miles. That's almost 10% of Canada's entire land area and over twice the size of California. That means that gold glints under rugged mountains and in more riverbeds than you could ever count. From the Fraser Canyon, where the story began, to the Caribou region of central BC, to the Amanika region in the north of the province, all the way out to the Haida Gwaii archipelago off the Pacific coast. Gold was discovered there as far back as 1851. But it's not just the gold. The land is rich in coal, silver, and copper too. In what is known as BC's boundary country, between the Kootenays to the east and the Similkameen to the west, you can find it all. And the people did, including Volcanic Brown.
So my name is Christopher Blair Stevenson. I've run a group called Boundary Heritage, which is a Facebook group which has 6,000 people or something for the last decade.
Christopher is a historian and president of the Boundary Museum. He lives in Grand Forks, a town in the heart of Boundary Country. The same place Volcanic Brown called home for over 40 years. The area sprawls across a verdant plain between the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Ocean. Grand Forks sits about 340 kilometers east of Metro Vancouver along the border with the United States, but only 170 kilometers northwest of Spokane, Washington. It's the largest city in Boundary Country and has a population of about 4,000 people nowadays. But in Brown's day, the settler population never topped more than about 1,500. Grand Forks was a good-sized settlement for such a remote section of the world. But Christopher Stevenson says there were always people in the area, well before the boundaries existed.
The colonial influence happened to the Sinaiax people and the Silex people, First Nations that lived in the area. It's an interesting region because the river runs east-west. So most of our geography in BC runs north-south with the valleys, with the mountains, with the rivers. The development part, as far as the colonial settler time period, really started in 1859, in the summer of 1859, when there was a massive gold strikes that happened. This is coming off the heels of San Francisco Gold Rush and then the Fraser Gold Rush in 1858. And then there was the discoveries at Rock Creek, and they say as many as 10,000 American miners poured across the border that summer to mine gold from Rock Creek.
Christopher says that during this time, settlers like Brown who arrived in the area in 1884 spent time on both sides of the border as he staked claims and prospected in the region.
There's always been a very strong connection with states, with Washington, and a lot of the development that happened here in the boundary was actually totally connected and funded because of Spokane and what was to the south. In the past, before 9/11 kind of closed the borders, people used to go back and forth all the time. Kids used to go to school back and forth, doctors, people used to regularly, and it was just a part of life.
And Boundary Country is where Volcanic Brown would enter his volcanic era. So, how did Brown get the name Volcanic? I have to admit, it's a pretty badass nickname. Like a superhero in a comic book. So, where did it come from? What's his origin story? Well, it's much simpler than you might think. Robert Crazy Brown, as he was known then, believed the richest deposits of precious metals were formed by powerful, explosive volcanic activity. Now, many people may not know this, especially because the Pacific Northwest of North America is known for its rainy weather and cool temperatures, but it's actually part of what is known as the Ring of Fire. Circling the Pacific Ocean are between 700 and 900 volcanoes, all part of the constant push and pull of the Earth's tectonic plates. And almost 20 of those massive volcanoes are located in what is called the Cascade Volcanic Arc. This group of volcanoes run in a curved line from Northern California over 1,000 kilometers up the Pacific coast to central BC. You may know some of their names: Mount Shasta, Mount Rainier, Mount Baker, Mount Garibaldi. And some of you will definitely remember Mount St. Helens.
This is a KEX News Bulletin. That appears the explosion we have long been fearing has occurred.
It's one of the most devastating natural explosions that our nation has ever known.
On May 18, 1980, the volcano located in Washington State, only 85 kilometers northeast of Portland, Oregon, that's about 50 miles for our American listeners, erupted. It killed 57 people, caused about $1.1 billion in property damage, and deposited ash across 11 states and 5 Canadian provinces. The only reason more people weren't killed was because the volcano's blast was to the north, away from the 1.3 million people who lived in the Portland area at the time. In fact, all of the region's biggest cities, including Seattle and Vancouver, are less than 100 kilometers away from an active yet dormant volcano. That's over 11 million people living in the shadow of these deadly forces of nature. And we'll save the earthquakes for another podcast. Stories of catastrophic volcanic eruptions in the region are chronicled in the oral histories of Coast Salish and other First Nations going back millennia. Mount Rainier, the highest peak in the Cascade Range, and a mere 50 kilometers from Seattle, last erupted in 1894, not long after Volcanic Brown established himself just across the border in BC. In fact, sometime after the 1880s, Brown located what he called Volcanic Mine on the western slope of what he also called Volcanic Mountain. That's right, he named a mountain located about 16 kilometers north of Grand Forks. Brown is quoted as saying he first staked his claim back in 1882, but other newspaper sources say 1886. The earliest mention of the claim in the press, however, was in Victoria's Daily Colonist newspaper on July 15, 1892, which stated, quote, "The principal prospect of Mr. Brown's company is on Volcanic Mountain, Kettle River," end quote. Volcanic Brown was adamant about the wealth and prosperity the mine would surely generate. And with his trademark bravado, he boasted, quote, "All the lead pencils in Grand Forks can't total up its value," end quote. Christopher Stevenson says some might be surprised to know that the main mineral Volcanic Brown was prospecting for wasn't gold.
The interesting thing about the boundary is that it's predominantly about copper mining, extraction, and smelting. The boundary was copper.
Volcanic Brown had a nose for unearthing all sorts of pay dirt. And by the end of the 19th century, the price of copper shot sky high.
At the time, electrification was going on all over the world. So what they needed it for was electric wires and wiring and electrification. So the timing was that they found these massive ore bodies of copper all through the boundary.
What's interesting is that as pioneering as he was, Volcanic Brown isn't credited as having discovered copper in Boundary Country. That position goes to American prospector Bob Denzler, who struck copper in the area known as Phoenix in 1891. Once called the highest city in Canada, it's now a ghost town. As stated at the top of this episode, that was the same year Slumuk was hanged for killing Louis B. in New Westminster, over 300 kilometers due west.
The Mother Lode, Phoenix, those areas, they also had to build huge smelters to deal with that. They got the ore, now they had to process it. So they built a smelter at Greenwood. And then you had the Granby Corporation, which had the mines at Phoenix. They built the second largest copper smelter in the British Empire, maybe the largest at the time.
Denzler's discovery was the first of many claims in the area. Less than 30 kilometers northwest of Grand Forks, a settlement called Greenwood Camp was built. This is not to be confused with Greenwood, just 11 kilometers to the west. Eventually, As the copper boom took hold and more people moved to the area, Greenwood Camp's rustic log cabins were replaced by frame houses and brick homes. Then, in 1896, both the Canadian Pacific Railway and the Great Northern Railway arrived, bringing settlers and exporting out copper.
In 1890 or so, mid-90s, all of a sudden you had all these people, all this development just explode in like a few years. 2 railways come in within no time. Smelters just sprung up, and they're massive operations. And all of a sudden you had these cities spring up like Phoenix and Greenwood and Cascade City over by Christina Lake. And you had all these smaller camps that were all over the place. Must have been just a fantastic place at the time of industry, business people, everything that goes along with that, coming here to set up shop and, establish themselves. Fantastic time.
On August 19th, 1895, Volcanic Brown's claim on Volcanic Mountain, called simply Brown's Camp, was mentioned in a list featured in the Midway Advance newspaper. Brown's Camp formed a large mining area barely 20 kilometers north of the border. Sprawling over 230 square kilometers across both sides of the Granby River, then called the North Fork of the Kettle River, Brown's Camp was one of dozens of claims in that stretch of boundary country north of Grand Forks. The Midway Advance also mentioned that Brown is, quote, now developing a copper claim in the Similkameen country. A shaft of 25 feet has been sunk, and the distance will be carried down 30 feet more before the end of the season. Mr. Brown's copper claims are reported as being enormous bodies of ore of great value, end quote. Similkameen country is the area just west of Boundary Country, not too far from the well-known Okanagan region, which is today known for its lakes and vineyards. It encompasses the Similkameen River Basin and straddles the border between Canada and the United States. Centered on the town of Princeton, the region was home to Copper Mountain, and Brown had a claim there too. Brown had claims on both Volcanic and Copper Mountain at the same time. The man got around.
Brown made some serious discoveries in British Columbia. He staked it all, and he basically worked his way across lower British Columbia.
That was former prospector and history buff Marc Ferrero. Like Brown, Ferrero had a nose for gold and other minerals, and looked for opportunities wherever he could find them.
I actively placer mined, or tried to, when I was a young fellow. I was very fortunate that I earned a very good living very young, and so I was able to travel a lot. I took a trip around BC with the intentions of dipping my pan in every well-known placer creek, just a pan, not looking, just to dip, because there were many that I hadn't visited. It took me a month and a half, and I still didn't complete. And there was a lot of travel in between that. Basically, get somewhere, drive in, do my thing, and then carry on to the next town. And there's so many, my God.
Indeed. In the mid-1890s, Brown and scores of other master prospectors had plenty of opportunities for mineral wealth. And he bet on Volcanic Mountain and Copper Mountain simultaneously. Meanwhile, the town of Phoenix was rising like the mythical creature between the two mountains. And yes, if you're wondering, the town was named after the other Phoenix in Arizona. Here again is Christopher Stevenson.
There was probably between 3,500 to 4,000 people up there. And it was one of the largest cities in BC at the time. I wouldn't say a lawless place, because there was a judge there called Willie Brown who was like 6'5", and he called himself the highest judge in the highest city in Canada or something like that. They had an opera house. They had a hospital. They had dozens of hotels. They had a couple of breweries. And you have to bear in mind that this is in completely inaccessible in the middle of nowhere. So you figure that it's the middle of the province. There's nothing around it. All of a sudden, within a few years, they build this city. One of the things is that the owners of the opera house asked people if they would not bring their bull terriers to the opera house. And if they did, if they could leave them outside. They had a hockey team that came within a hair of competing for the Stanley Cup in I think it was 11.
The boom was on in full force, so much that by the end of the 1800s, two things happened. First, on August 26, 1899, the Cascade Record newspaper published a list of boundary town sites, among them, Volcanic City. It appeared for the first time in the press because there was a problem. There were two places by that name, Brown's, plus another town site a mile away. And it had submitted a post office application in July. Quote, "We, the undersigned residents of this district, beg and pray that the following petition asking for the establishment of a post office in this district will be met with your approval. Also, we, the undersigned, pray that Arthur S. Williamson be appointed postmaster at Volcanic City." End quote. Arthur Williamson was a shopkeeper from a nearby town. Even though many of the petitioners were residents of Brown's camp, Brown himself had not signed the petition. In the end, Brown won the war of the post office and secured the name Volcanic City for his would-be metropolis. The other town site changed its name to Toronto, then to Eagle City. The second notable event was the first appearance in print of Brown's most enduring nickname. On September 6, 1899, the Nelson Tribune referred to him as, quote, R.A. Brown, known far and wide as Volcanic Brown, end quote.
Who wants to be called Robert when you can be called Volcanic? Right? How hot is that? Walk into a room, Robert? No. Volcanic? Oh, yeah.
Christopher says that one thing is for sure, Volcanic Brown definitely seemed like the type of man who wanted to give his name longevity. It wasn't just about the fame.
He tried to boost and build what he hoped would be, permanent prosperity. And so he had a place called Volcanic City.
My buddy Adam Palmer agrees that Brown wanted to create a lasting legacy in the midst of a rapidly modernizing world. Something made of brick and mortar that was somewhat free from outside influences. Something unique and impactful.
He had a dream to set up. He was kind of a rebel in the way, is he saw the world kind of developing really fast around him, and he wanted to kind of slow it down. And he was going to build a city around that. And that city was going to be different. There was going to be no influence of religion. There was going to be no influence of the big machine or the institutions that were soon taking a stronghold during those days. And, that claim, Volcanic City, that was going to be a big deal in Canada at the time. That was going to be a self-supporting, self-sufficient little town, all built around this claim, Volcanic City.
Building a city isn't a simple undertaking. It requires planning and patience. In 1906, the Kettle Valley Railway, a subsidiary of the Canadian Pacific, announced plans to build an extension up the North Fork. Brown applied for a hotel license, and the Nelson Daily Canadian reported, quote, Volcanic Town Site is the very latest town site to spring into existence. It is owned by R.A. Brown of Volcanic Mountain. The town site has been plotted, and lots are already being sold. The Volcanic Hotel is now open, and William Rodia and Mike Scully, formerly businessmen of Nelson, have formed a partnership for the purpose of starting a large general merchandise store at Volcanic City, end quote. Supposedly Brown had deeds made out stating that, quote, no church people or saloon men shall be allowed to build on the lots, end quote. Here's retired prospector Marc Ferrero.
He had some absolutely zany ideas. There was something about women, a very sexist attitude, that were really not allowed to speak unless they were asked a direct question by by their man or a man, I don't know. But anyways, the other part of it was there were going to be no churches in town. They were allowed to be located on the outskirts, but they couldn't actually be within the town limits. The bars were going to be open 24 hours a day, so a man could have a drink whenever he wished. And children didn't have to go to school if they didn't want to. Okay, the bars 24 hours a day I could see because that was the mindset in those days, and booze was rampant anyways, right? But You couldn't have a church in town limits. No, that wouldn't ever fly. And the other part about women, that was just chauvinism and sexism, right? Like, I mean, did you ever actually think that, that would ever come? No, I don't think so. I think it was just him being Volcanic Brown.
So much for the no saloon men. It was golden days and copper nights for Boundary Country. The rise in boomtowns like Phoenix, Greenwood, Eagle City, and soon Volcanic City were making names and money for themselves throughout the West.
And then in 1919, it all shut down. Within 6 months, everybody but 4 people were gone from Phoenix.
Phoenix, Greenwood, Eagle City, Volcanic City. Some of these places still exist today, but as I mentioned earlier, some of them are ghost towns. Others only exist in the history books and in the dreams of fortune hunters on the trail of gold. But why? If this region was such a booming, freewheeling place of commerce, industry, culture, and opportunity, what happened? What happened to Volcanic City?
Everybody. It just emptied right out. So it had 20 years of life, and then it was gone.
And how did Volcanic Brown's legend become part of the legend of the lost gold mine?
His name is remembered when 99.9% of the population at that time, nobody knows who the heck they were, but remember Volcanic Brown, don't we?
That's next time on Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold. Thank you for joining me, and special thanks to Christopher Stevenson, Adam Palmer, and Marc Ferrero for their work on this episode. Dead Man's Curse is hosted by myself, Kru Williams, and written by Ernest White II and Dila Velasquez. Our producers are Dila Velasquez and Jessica Young. Audio producers are Rosalind Kufor and Rob Johnston. Sound design by Rob Johnston. Our associate producer and Indigenous cultural and heritage consultant is Gail Starr. Our executive producers are Chris Duncombe, Ernest White II, Michael Francis, Kru Williams, Tim Hardy, and David Way. Dead Man's Curse is a production of Curious Cast, podcast for curious minds, and Great Pacific Media. For more information on this episode, follow us on social media, check out our website, and check out our show notes for additional information. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time on Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold.